Good morning and welcome to the second day of Abo Agora Void. It is my pleasure to introduce the first speaker of the day. Hans Ruin is a professor of philosophy at Södertörn University in Stockholm. He is specialized in ancient philosophy and in phenomenology and hermeneutics, especially Heidegger and Nietzsche. He has co-edited the Swedish edition of Nietzsche's collected works. He has also translated and commented on the fragments of Heraclitus in a book that was recently reissued as a revised edition. The most recent among the several books he has written is Being with the Dead, Burial, Ancestral Politics, and the Roots of Historical Consciousness. In his Abo Agora talk, titled Words from the Void, the Poetics of Being and Non-Being in Early Greek Philosophy, Hans Ruin will address the question of how to handle constant change. How can we conceptualize the fact that nothing seems to remain stable and that the world is constantly displaying new features? Please.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. I will, since I have such a generous time frame, we have 90 minutes, and the organizer said that I can speak up to an hour. I think I will not speak a full hour, but maybe 50 or 55 minutes, so you're a little bit prepared, so a little longish lecture, but we will have time for discussion, I hope. So, around 500 before Christ, or Common Era, a writer named Parmenides, who lived in the city of Elia on the southern tip of what is now Italy, across the strait from Sicily, composed a long poem in Homeric dactylic hexameter. We hardly know anything about this man, or what title he gave to his poem, but in the later reception it was generally known under the title On Nature, Periphyseos. This extraordinary text was preserved for us in large parts thanks to the fact that it was copied almost 1,000 years later into a commentary on Aristotle's physics, which then in turn survived into modern times. But throughout the ancient intellectual world, this poem circulated widely, was read and discussed by many. It is a remarkable piece of writing, a literary construction that connects the world of mythic poetry with the nascent world of rational scientific spirit. It is a door, one can say, that connects them and through which we can still pass 2.5 millennia later. And I just quoted the first lines there. I will come back to this poem later. When we come to Aristotle, a new kind of rationality is invented, one in which the contemporary scientific mindset can reflect and recognize itself more immediately in its attitude and its comportment vis-à-vis knowledge and the explanation of nature. It is also with Aristotle and his school that the standard accounts of writing the earlier history of philosophy is invented and codified, making them the precursors of the present, or as we are commonly say, the Presocratics, so the philosophers before Socrates. But from the previous thinkers and poets who speak from a time when the shape of rational discourse is still not codified or settled, we can perceive a voice of a different kind, a threshold voice that discloses ways of seeing and ways of accessing rationality in its emergence. We tend to look only at their results, and when we teach them, it's usually in terms of the names that they give to the original substance and the origin of the world. so teaching water, fire, air, etc. But as such, they risk disappearing again as only stations on the way to a more mature conception of the world and its technological mastery. But the reading of these texts should instead try to maintain itself on the level of their own disclosive aspiration and to see how they configure the condition or the moment of trying to see more clearly. Parmenides' poem is shaped as a narrative within a religious and mythical framework. It depicts a mystical educational journey towards enlightenment into the nature of being, of the toion or toenai, carried out by the author himself under the guidance of a goddess. It depicts a journey into a new mode of vision, a journey beyond nature, a metaphysical journey, we could say, beyond the visible and changing nature towards a more stable and permanent truth. It rejects those who pretend to know and speak about non-being or the nothing, the meon, in the place of which the enlightened author instead presents his account of true being, of being as it really is. The means of doing so is what the poet refers to as his logos, his reasoning, his understanding or rationality, or however we should translate this mysterious concept of the logos. Around the same time as Parmenides, and we are speaking about 500 BC, a writer on the other side of the Greek Mediterranean territory by the name of Heraclitus is writing and working in the city of Ephesus, which is now on the west coast of Turkey. He writes a preface to his book of philosophical reflection that reads like this: "And of this account, this logos, that is always, humans are uncomprehending, both before they hear it and once they have first heard it. For although all things come about according to this account or this logos, they resemble people without experience, both of words and things of the sort that I explain when I analyze each in conformity with its nature and indicate how it is." So it's a book that starts by saying that none of my readers understand what I'm saying. So you realize where Wittgenstein got his inspiration. So people, what it says that people cannot see, they cannot apprehend what is there in front of them. They are ignorant of the world that they inhabit. There is another world beyond and inside the visible world for those who have eyes to see, who can break away from habit and from inherited conceptions. In another preserved fragment from the partially reconstructed text of Heraclitus, he refers to how the lovers of wisdom, the philosophoi, how they should act and think. And this mentioning of the word philosophoi is actually the first example we have of this term in any Greek text. So it's maybe that it was even Heraclitus who invented it. When I accepted the invitation to come here and speak, I wasn't sure what I could or should contribute. I had never come across Musashi's handbook that was the inspiration of this 5-year circle. Even though I have studied some Zen Buddhism and also practiced some Zen meditation over the years, this book I was not familiar with. Its basis in the art of swordsmanship reminded me a little bit of Eugene Herrigel's book, Zen and the Art of Archery, which is, of course, a very different kind of book for those of you who are familiar with it. It's written by a German scholar in the 1930s, so it's a European perspective on the same kind of Buddhist-inspired martial arts. But Musashi's text, and I read it to prepare myself for this, and I think it's a fascinating combination of both practical and reflective intelligence, written by somebody who was able to put into words a very hard-won capacity and a comportment. And in a beautiful way, he communicates his insights through the poetic use of the Buddhist five-element theory of earth, water, fire, wind, and space, or void, or emptiness, or how it's translated. In the short excursus on emptiness, which is the shortest part of the book, he summarizes its central ethical practical message, and that is one of abandoning one's own self-centeredness in favor of being prepared for the possible. Emptiness is the non-being or the not yet being in its literal and traditional sense, designating what is vacuous, what is hollow, or void. It is also a word for sky or air, and in a more metaphorical sense, what is in vain. But here in Musashi's book, it corresponds, as I understand it, primarily to a kind of free readiness on the part of the human being, and in his case, the swords warrior. So it has nothing to do with ignorance or non-knowledge or lack of focus. Quite the opposite. It is about being attentive to the place where one is, as demonstrated in an ability to respond to the demands of the situation in an adequate way. As such, it is related to virtues such as clarity, truthfulness, and also humbleness. In the English version of Musashi's preface, it is likened to a spontaneous entry into the true world. I also looked up, since I don't know any Japanese, I also looked up the German translation, the Buch der Lehre, where it says, he writes about festgehalten, wie man seine naturfolgenden wahren Weg betritt. So how one can access the true way by following one's nature. And the French translation has a similar version. It says, tout naturellement, il faut entrer dans la voie véritable. So something like sort of entering into or accessing the true in a natural way. These different translations of one single sentence reminds us of the difficulty in coming to terms with the spiritual universe when we don't have the knowledge of the original language in which it was written. But whatever its nuances, this is a book clearly about the art of swordsmanship as a basis for articulating how to live well. It is a practical form of spirituality. It's not concerned with metaphysics or being as such, but rather what we in Western Greek terminology would speak of as an ethics. As such, it partly reminds me of the style of sort of the ancient Stoic handbooks in ethics that also stress how a good and well-lived life should not fear loss, it should not fear death, it should always be prepared, especially for the unexpected. So asking myself then, how could I respond in an adequate way from the perspective of my own research activity to this kind of context? And it was then that I landed in the suggestion that I speak about pre-Socratic philosophy. As was mentioned in the introduction, many years ago, actually it's 25 years ago, I published this first, this is actually what I wanted to show you also as my inspiration for speaking about Heraclitus. I'll give you another slide short. This is what I had in mind when I said I associated Musashi with the Presocratics. It's a beautiful fragment by Heraclitus. If one does not expect the unexpected, one will not find it, for it cannot be searched or nor arrived at. So, sorry, what happened to my... here it was. This was the slide. So, 25 years ago, I published together with a friend and colleague this edition of the Heraclitean fragments in Swedish, and then it was sold out for long, and then a small new publishing house reissued it this year. So that for me meant going back to my commentaries and the text, and it inspired me also to try to bring together what I've been thinking about this material over the years. So now I'm actually preparing a book, my own book of essays on this material. I hope I will be able to finish it during the coming years, coming year. So the reason for suggesting a theme connected to Presocratics also had to do with the specific topic, of course, of the conference, that of emptiness as a sense of the unexpected and how to relate to non-being. And this was when I wanted to show you this slide. And this way of thinking, it seemed to me, resonated well with the teaching of this Japanese sword master. And I think it also contains a good piece of advice for anybody working with research, and not least with intellectual history. You have to be prepared for what you cannot prepare for when you're looking to find something new. The name Heraclitus will be familiar to most of you. He's probably the most famous among the philosophers that were active during the 150 years or so before Socrates. For this reason, these philosophers were clumped together under the label Presocratic philosophers, which is a name that in research today people are actually trying to move away from in favor of the more neutral term early Greek philosophy as a name for the philosophers from approximately 600 BC to around 400 BC. So I wanted to show you this slide. The most famous edition of the pre-Socratic writings is the one put together by the German philologist Hermann Diels. It's a bad picture there, first in 1903 and then in later edition together with his assistant colleague Walter Krantz. And they collected all the fragments by these early philosophers. But a couple of years ago, a huge endeavor was completed by Cambridge University Press by the French, Mexican, and American philologists Glenn Most and André Lacks, where they have redone the entire work of Hermann Diels and expanded his catalog of texts. But they call their volume, it's in 9 volumes, but they call it Early Greek Philosophy. So this is now the standard term. A third reason for wanting to speak about the pre-Socratics in this context is that at this stage of thinking and intellectual practices, there is still no clear border between what we think today of as the distinction between science and art. The writings of these people are both poetry, literature, theology, philosophy, science, logic, what have you, all at once. The distinction has not been made. And there has not been set up any institutional frameworks for what you should do in particular spaces. So it's a kind of early experimentative phase of the entire intellectual adventure of Western rationality. And this makes them especially interesting also for this kind of context to think about. So it's a kind of traveling back to the genealogy of our own mindset, as it were. How should we understand change? How can we understand motion? How can we understand transformation from non-being to being? Heraclitus is famous for having captured, in the most poetically evocative terms, the nature of a world in constant motion and transformation. It was, after all, he who wrote, "We step and we do not step into the same river. We are and we are not. It is always different waters that flow towards those who step into the same rivers." I think you will all recognize this fragment. It's probably the most famous one. In Parmenides' poem, we read instead the words, "That it is, and that's impossible for it not to be, is the trustworthy way, for it travels with the truth. The other, that it is not, and that it must needs not be, that I tell you is a non-convincing way." In standard shorthand introductions to the early history of Western thinking, the two figures of Heraclitus and Parmenides were often juxtaposed as opposites. Against Heraclitus, as the philosopher of change and movement, we have Parmenides, the philosopher of stability and non-changing being. Over the years, some people even argued that Parmenides, who was probably somewhat younger of these two, we don't know their dates, exact dates of course, maybe he was even targeting Heraclitus explicitly, criticizing his colleague on the other side of the Mediterranean when he spoke about the views of the mortals who hold that it is and it's not the same, that it is and it is not at the same time, and that things travel in opposite directions. But the way that his poem is constructed, it seems very unlikely that he would be referring to a writer of his own generation or immediately before him. We need not preoccupy ourselves with this long discussion that's been going on for hundreds of years. What is clear is that both of them, to my mind, it's obvious, both of them are rather struggling with the previous tradition. They are both thinkers who are trying to come to terms with a kind of conventional way of seeing things. They are agonistic writers, we can say. It's an agon, it's a strife. And this can be seen especially in the way that Heraclitus, who mentions some of the earlier thinkers, especially Homer, Heraclitus, Xenophanes, and Hesiod, in critical terms. So you can see that they are sort of trying to break new space. And Hesiod is the one I especially want to highlight here. Here, these statues, as you know, are all fantasies. All the images we have of these philosophers were made in Roman times. So idealized figures. So of course there is no one who knows what they look like. Hesiod, who lived around 500 BC. So we're talking about a writer who is almost 150, 200 years older than the early philosophers, Heraclitus and Parmenides. His two preserved poems, Theogony and the Work and Days, was composed not so long after Homer. So he's sort of really at the very first stage of Greek writing. This is the time when the Greek alphabet is invented, this magical alphabet that with its vowels made it possible to create literature in a way that no other language had been able to do at this point, and which also made it possible for us to still be reading these texts from almost 3,000 years back by Homer and Hesiod. The Theogony is concerned with how things started, the arche, the beginning of all things, their genesis and their development, The term theogony literally means the birth or the emergence of the gods. So it is around these three figures that I have now mentioned, Hesiod, Parmenides, and Heraclitus, that I will spend the rest of my time. In a presentation that focuses on how they, in their different ways, configurate and convey the emergence of vision or understanding. For all of them, it's a matter of becoming one who sees clearly through the mist of common and inherited perception by approaching and entering a foreign space, a space that both Hesiod and Parmenides speak of as a chasm, an abyss, or perhaps a void. Ever since the beginning of the 19th century, when the whole genre of history of philosophy was invented, the way that we still study it in the university, a recurring question has been raised, namely, how should we view and understand the emergence of philosophy? And when we ask this question, we're also asking, how should we understand the emergence of rationality, of science, of what we take to be the essence of our culture from the background in mythical, religious, superstitious thinking? And from early on, it became common to frame this relation precisely in terms of the contrast between mythos and logos, between myth and reason, a formulation that echoes a critique of the early thinkers that we find already in Plato. Also, Aristotle can be seen as an early proponent of this. When he comments Hesiod in his Metaphysics, when he's writing about the earlier predecessors of philosophers, he says, well, Hesiod, he was also trying to understand things about how things started. But, he says, perhaps he was more of a theologos than a physiologos, so more of a theologian than a physicist or a philosopher of nature. This long discussion how to view the transition from mythos to logos has never ended, and it continues up until this day. A book that I read for inspiration for this talk that just came out last year has the title Hesiod and the Beginning of Greek Philosophy, and it's a collection from Brill that came last year with some of the best philologians now working, who again address this question. How should we look at the relation between a writer like Hesiod and what happens among the early philosophers? Because since the tension between these comportments, the mythical and the logical, constitute sort of the center or the backbone of our modern Enlightenment culture, to return to it and open it up again inevitably involves confronting also intellectual debates in the present about the limits and distinctions in the field of knowing and knowledge practices, the relation between science, religion, art, etc. So we're sort of still rehearsing this origin as a way to discuss with ourselves today. But instead of trying to pin down again exactly in time and in which author this line between myth and reason should be drawn, which is an interminable debate, I suggest another approach to this body of writing and to look at it from another perspective, in a reading that tries to see how these different writers poeticize and dramatize the event of enlightenment itself, the event of seeing, and the access to truth, and how they evoke for this purpose the basic terms of being, of logos, of truth, aletheia, as both a power inherent in man and in the universe at large. And in performing this experiment with the material, I want to focus not primarily on their metaphysical principles, but on the way that this literature articulates the transformation of the human mind into one who sees and understands. And this is why I spoke in my title of a Poetics of Being. So, to Hesiod. Hesiod is actually unique among the oldest Greek authors compared to the somewhat older but much more mythically fuzzy character of Homer, whom we don't even know if he existed as an actual writer. Hesiod was an historical person, and we know some things about where he came from and his family history, because he also writes about it in his poetry. And we have these two almost complete poems by him, Theogony and Works and Days. In this Theogony, the poet describes himself as encountering and being led and taught by the gods themselves. Holding out the possibility of learning the truth, both of the origin of the gods and of the cosmos. And he begins his long poem, and this is a new translation that came only a few years ago, also by Glenn Most, a leading American philologist. And the poem begins like this: "Let us begin to sing from or of the Heliconian muses, who possess the great and holy mountain of Helicon, and dance on their soft feet around the violet dark fountain and the altar of Cronius' mighty son. Starting out from there, shrouded in thick invisibility, by night they walk, sending forth their very beautiful voice, singing of Aegis holding Zeus and queenly Hera of Argos." And after having recalled all of these divinities, the poet then mobilizes the support of the muses, describing himself as their student and their follower. So there the poet says, "And this speech the goddess spoke first of all to me, the Olympian muses, the daughters of Aegis holding Zeus." And then so the poem quotes what the goddess said to the poet: "Field-dwelling shepherds, ignoble disgraces, mere bellies. We know how to say many false things, similar to genuine ones, but we know, when we wish, how to proclaim true things. And they breathed a divine voice into me, so that I might glorify what will be and what was before. And they commanded me to sing of the race of the blessed ones who always are, but always to sing of themselves, first and last." It is thus an inspired poem of the origin of all things, in which the poet refers to the teaching of the goddess as a source of his own truth. He then recounts how he turns to them, to these muses, asking them to tell him how it was, how did it all start, what is the arche, the beginning, where everything began, and how the gods themselves came into being and everything was first generated. And this is when they tell to him their story, which he has written down in his poem. And they tell him that first there was chaos, and Erebos and black night came to be, and then ether and day came forth from night, who conceived and bore them after the mingling in love with Erebos. And you see that the translatum here has chasm, but the Greek is chaos, and I will comment on that shortly. So first there was chaos. This is what the goddess tell him. And toward the end of the long poem, after having recounted the story of all the divinities and their complex interaction and the struggles between them and the shape of this world, Hesiod returns to the distinction between darkness and light that he depicts as an encounter and a changing of guards that occurs at the deepest depths of Tartarus. And he describes it like this. So this is towards the end of the poem. That is where the sources and the limits of the dark earth are, and of the murky Tartarus, of the barren sea, and of the starry sky, of everything one after another, distressful, dank things, which even the gods hate, a great chasm, chasma. Here we have the real word, chasma, whose bottom one would not reach in a whole long year. It is terrible for the immortal gods as well, this monstrosity, and the terrible houses of dark night stand there, shrouded in black clouds. In front of these, Iapetus' son holds the broad sky with his head and tireless hands, standing immovable where night and day, passing near, greet one another as they cross the great bronze threshold. In view of our overall theme, I want to stop here and reflect on the specific word that appears here in different forms, namely that of chaos and the related chasma. The Greek language has a verb which is chaino, sometimes also written chasko, with the meaning to gape or yawn, to open one's mouth as to swallow, but also as a metaphor of dying, as being swallowed up by the earth. In the Homer's Iliad, there is a passage where one of the protagonists at one point calls out, "Let the great earth gape and take me down." So then the mouth is really sort of the route down to the underworld. The responding noun to the word chaskochaina is chasma. So in a chasm, an abyss, an opening or a void, or also as the sort of the void of an open mouth. But this word chasma does not appear in Homer. So if we look at the Homeric lexicon, we don't find this word. Homer only has the verb. But it does appear in Hesiod. And in Hesiod, it's called forth to designate that ultimate space in the sky, a great chasm whose bottom one would not reach, where night and day come together. But it's also in Hesiod that we find a word that sounds quite similar, which is the word of chaos. Chaos. And as you noticed from the translation by Glenn Most, he chooses to translate chaos. This is in the genitive, so it's chaos. He chooses to translate it as chasm. And as a footnote to his translation, he adds, usually this is translated as chaos, but that suggests to us, misleadingly, a jumble of disordered matter, whereas Hesiod's term indicate instead a gap or an opening. So for this reason, he translates chaos with the modern word chasm, but it creates a kind of confusion for the reader because chasm is also a Greek word, and it's used by Hesiod at a later point of the book to describe a different kind of space, which is the space where night and day come together. So I'm not, even though Glenn Most's reflection on the problem of the word chaos is legitimate, the translation becomes a little bit confusing. But for us, who are now talking about the void, it's worth stopping around this concept of chaos. Because what is the original sense of this chaos? The chaos that Glenn Most didn't even want to use. Because for us, as he says, chaos means just confusion, well, chaos means chaos. We don't have a better word, right? So how can we think about the original chaos? What was Hesiod thinking about when he perhaps even invented the word chaos? Because there is no example of the word chaos in any earlier Greek text. So the first time we encountered this concept, it is in Hesiod's poem as the name of the origin from out of which everything comes. The earth, black night, etc. There is an article, you might have heard of the famous Swedish philologist Hjalmar Frisk, who published in the 1950s his etymological dictionary. And he has an article about chaos. And he says there, we cannot know exactly what chaos meant in the beginning. Hesiod is the first person, he says, to use it. But for him, it's clearly a name for the initial state of the world, its ultimate origin. As a result of the great resonance of this poem in later Greek thinking and imagination, the notion of chaos will later be used by other writers. In Aristotle, for example, chaos is used sometimes as a synonym for void in his physics, or empty space. And some writers use it as following Hesiod as a name for the primordial darkness or origin. So we cannot know exactly what Hesiod meant. And Frisk, in his dry tone of voice, says, what ideas Hesiod and his predecessors within mythological cosmology associated with chaos is not possible to determine with certainty. So chaos is, we cannot reach to the root of chaos. And Frisk stresses the significance of that which is open and determinate. And he says maybe chaos has a connection to another adjective in Greek, which is chaunos, which means spongy. And he says maybe it has to do something with air. But Frisk also notes what some people have argued, that chaos and chasma actually have the same root, which I think is a more interesting and in a sense reasonable interpretation. That chaos is maybe a poetical invention that also recalls the chasma, a kind of original gaping void. So when Hesiod reaches out for a word that can designate the inception of everything, he forges this term that recalls both the chasko and the chasma, the gaping and the gape, the gaping mouth or the throat, to designate a space out of which something first appears. And if we follow him along this trajectory, we could perhaps also think about it in a more speculative sense as also the source of breath and breathing, and thereby also the source of speech and language. If we think about it as the mouth of the world, the original chaos, it is both a breathing, threatening and benevolent, as a source of danger and unending generativity and birth. When the first Ionic philosophers from Ionia, eastern part of Mediterranean, begin to appear about a century after Hesiod, starting with Thales, the famous Presocratic from whom we only know that he at one point should have said that everything begins with water. We're talking about writers about 600 BC, about 100 years later. We know there are different suggestions about the origin of everything from the introductory philosophy classes. There are suggestions about water, air, fire, etc. But actually, the oldest authentically preserved fragment from these earliest philosophers, Anaximander, speaks of the original substance of the world, not as any of these materials, but something that he calls the indeterminate or the unlimited, to apeiron, out of which everything emerges and into which it returns again. But from Anaximander, just as is the case with Thales and most other of the earlier thinkers, we have very little original textual sources. In this respect, Parmenides stands out as a special case in that his cosmological and metaphysical poem is one of the most fascinating and well-preserved examples of the transition from Hesiod's poetic mythology to something that anticipates a scientific and logical rationality in the sense that we usually think about it. So we shall now turn to read Parmenides' poem in view of what we have seen in Hesiod. The beginning of this poem not only recalls the narrative structure of Hesiod's theogony, it also engages with the predecessor's journey in a striking case of poetic and philosophical rivalry. The poet-narrator in Parmenides' poem tells how he, a man of knowledge, as he calls himself, is carried by horses and led by a goddess. And this is how the poem begins. The steeds that bear me carried me as far as ever my heart desired, since they brought me and set me on the renowned way to the goddess, who with her own hands conducts the man who knows through all things. There are the gates of the ways of night and day, fitted above with a lintel and below with a threshold of stone. They themselves high in the air are closed by mighty doors, and avenging justice keeps the keys that open them. So standing before this same door that Hesiod portrayed as the place that no man can enter and across which not even the gods will go, this Parmenidean traveler makes his way with the help of his goddess. And he continues like this. Her did the maidens entreat with gentle words and skillfully persuade to unfasten without demur the bolted bars from the gates. So the maidens are his sort of travel companions, divine travel companions, and they convince the great goddess of justice that she should let him in. So the poet-philosopher or the philosopher-poet should now go longer than his predecessor dared to go in towards the heart of things. And then when the doors were thrown back, they disclosed a wide opening, a chasma, when their brazen hinges swung backwards in the sockets, fastened with rivets and nails. The word here, which is translated wide opening, as you see, is chasma, the same word that we saw in Hesiod's poem. And through this choice of word, it is obvious that the philosopher-poet Parmenides is traveling in the poetic space of his predecessor Hesiod. He has now entered this vast abyss that in Hesiod was located at the gates of the netherworld, and that had been described as inaccessible to travelers, both human and divine. He has entered this forbidden domain. And why? In order to seek knowledge. This journey towards enlightenment is the first and founding myth of philosophy, more so than the Platonic cave, composed 125 years later. It is at this point that his divine guides begin to speak to him of the highest truths. And this is what they say to Parmenides, the writer, poet, philosopher. Welcome, O youth. that come to my abode on the car that bears thee, tended by immortal charioteers. It is no ill chance, but right and justice that has sent you forth to travel on this way. Far indeed does it lie from the beaten track of men. You should learn all things, as well as the unshaken heart of well-rounded truth, the aletheia, as the opinions of mortals in which is no true belief at all. Yet none the less shalt thou learn these things also, how passing right through all things one should judge the things that seem to be. So, in place of the views of mortals, he is to be taught the stable and eternal truths. And then she begins to teach him, stating her enigmatic lesson in the following way. The first, namely, that it is, and that it is impossible for it not to be, is the way of belief, for truth is its companion. The other, namely, that it is not, and that it must not, needs not be, that I tell you is a path that none can learn of at all. For you cannot know what is not. That is impossible, nor utter it. For it is the same thing that can be thought and that can be. That's perhaps the most famous line from this poem. It is the same thing to think and to be. I shall not let you say nor think that it came from what is not, for it can neither be thought nor uttered that anything is not. And if it came from nothing, what need would have made it arise later rather than sooner? This passage from Parmenides' poem is one of the most dense texts from the entire ancient philosophical corpus, and one that has challenged interpreters for millennia. What is the message here? What is it really that he claims that the goddess has taught him? What is this way of being which is here explicitly contrasted with the way of non-being? What does he mean by equating thinking and being? The questions multiply, and we could no doubt spend our entire 90 minutes pondering only this passage. I will only say a few things at this point and in direct relation to our theme. Here the poet-thinker leads his reader up against the ultimate void, the void of nothingness, in order to negate it. In short, negating the nothing. In order to make being appear in its fullness, the goddess, through the poet, throws out her no to nothing, taking upon herself, as it were, the force of this negation. It is what I suggest we could even call a kind of chiasmatic gesture, sort of inventing the no as a strategy against the nothing in order to open up the gaze for what really is, to make it fully present. Real understanding is concerned with being, with how it is, beyond the transitoriness of perception that sees only change. This is why the goddess says a few lines further on, look steadfastly with your mind at things, though afar, as if they were at hand. The premise is the criticism of the opinions of the ordinary mortals who are unable to see things from beyond the constant transformation of the world. The thinker, as led by divine inspiration, will argue instead that thinking should follow both what is present and what is not present, toward that balancing something to which only thinking opens the door. The poet-thinker, knowledge-seeker here presents himself as traveling paths where no one else has traveled. He does not recognize the limits set up by mortals, but is prepared to look deeper into a beyond and to transform the unknown and the unseen into what the mind, his nous, can master. He travels with the gods into a gaping chasm in order to find his voice. In this poetic dramatization of the adventure of knowledge, the thinker makes use of the poet's tools, but in order finally to leave his poetic predecessor Hesiod behind. In standard textbooks, In standard textbooks, Parmenides and his Eleatic Western school of philosophy is often described as a criticism of the natural philosophers from Ionia on the other side, and especially of Heraclitus. But I think a closer reading of the text, as I've tried to show you, will make you see that there is no discussion really in Parmenides of the other natural philosophers. The main rival in this drama is clearly Hesiod. This becomes even more clear when we reach the end of the poem, where Parmenides summarizes the so-called beliefs of mortals. Maybe, no, I don't have that slide. Okay. The beliefs of mortals, he said, are characterized by a dualism of light and darkness, the fire of heaven and dark night as a compact and heavy body. They are unable to see beyond the dichotomy. They have distinguished them as opposite in form, have assigned to them marks distinct from one another. But through this division, they are unable to see what brings and holds them together. And this is really directed against Hesiod's very sort of dualist, dichotomist way of describing the world in terms of night and day. And in a separate fragment of the poem, Parmenides writes, still in the voice of the thinking goddess, "Now that all things have been named light and night, and the names which belong to the power of each have been assigned to these things and those, everything is full at once of light and dark night, both equal, since beyond neither of them there is nothing." In the new collection on Hesiod that I mentioned, Catherine Morgan writes the following. She says, "The goal seems to be, in Parmenides, to present a vision of reality and the mortal world that appropriates and supersedes its Hesiodic predecessor." And this, I think, is a good way of putting it. But the question is how? How does he deal with his poetic, mythical predecessor? The poet of reason and of being, Parmenides, stages himself as a hero on a journey to a place to which no one else has traveled. On this journey, he is traveling with the help of the daughters of the sun, from the darkness to light, and also into the secret of their unity, in order, as he says, to convey me into the light. They threw back their veils from off their faces and left the abode of night. And thus he reaches the gates of the ways of night and day. Hesiod, as we saw, had described this space as a terrifying, but the poet-philosopher enters it with the help of the goddess of justice, speaking from a place in and of which nobody has yet spoken. His poem situates itself in this abyss, opening its discourse from a place that nobody else has seen, in order to challenge the image of this world as it had previously been described by the very popular and praised poet. Challenging his dichotomous universe, it seeks to speak beyond the dichotomy, with a voice that can find its force from within this indeterminate abyss. Its rationality, its logic, in this sense, I would say, is itself abyssal. It turns away from the eyes and the words of mortals to speak through the eyes and voice of the goddess, whose mouthpiece it claims to be. What it says cannot be seen or said by a mortal who can only listen to its teaching once he has made this journey. If we follow the poetic logic of this Parmenidean discourse, we can see how it's only from a position of elsewhere, beyond the world of ordinary mortals, that this world can be grasped, described, and understood. This other view, this gaze, not from nowhere, but from elsewhere, from a beyond, is how the beginning voice of reason and of truth here experiences and poetically dramatizes itself. The poet-philosopher shares this position with the earlier cosmogonic poet Hesiod, but with the difference that he has traveled further into this divine, strange, and uncanny environment. So the movement from mythos to logos, I think, should be thought in a different way than we usually think about it, as only a straight line, sort of in terms of development. It's a refiguration of the mythic space where this reason is invented. And if we try to think this dramatization of rationality one step further, beyond its allegorical surface, we can also ask a question about from where it is articulated. The poet-thinker in Parmenides' poem claims to speak through the goddess. Within the voice of the poem, another voice thus opens up and speaks. The transition from one site of discourse to another within the text constitutes what I would suggest calling a kind of chasmatic voicing of the poem. It opens up a gap within itself. It reveals a double displacement of the poet-thinker. First he travels to this abyssal space where nobody has been. Then he opens a chasm within its own discourse as he gives the word to the goddess. Thus its voice in the central philosophical metaphysical passage is a spacing in its own right. When we read as a poetic and narratological strategy, it discloses the voice of philosophical reason as the birth of a mode of speech, as it steps forward and presenting itself. This problem of the poem, from where and how the rational philosophical reasoning has not yet been settled at this point. It's still being invented. It's a discourse in the making. Philosophy is not there yet as an institution. It's not only the logic of its genre that is still seeking its form. It's also the discursive position itself which is being invented. And in terms of the outer shape, Parmenides is still located within the traditional framework of the epic poem and its traditional Homeric meter, but he uses this form to call forth and invent a discourse, a discursive order whose purpose it is to disclose how it is and thus say the truth, aletheia, by reaching into and yet beyond the world of immediate perceptual appearance. He's seeking a measure in the measureless. It's an attempt to reach a position from which we can see and from which we can speak. It is no longer concerned with birth and death and transformation, but that which lies deeper. He calls it being, toon. It is a being that does not stand over and against a non-being. Instead, it incorporates negativity through a grasping seeing of what is not present to the eye. Here reason, nous, logos, emerge itself as a kind of chasma, which holds all things together, encompassing them also in their absence. This is the chasmatic, poetic invention of philosophy. Thank you. And as a last slide for you to contemplate, I show you this famous quotation from Heraclitus.